War has always been a contest of invention. But sometimes it isn't the most expensive weapon that changes history. Sometimes it's the one everyone laughed at. In the closing years of World War II, the seas of Northern Europe became graveyards of steel. Germany's proud navy, once feared across the Atlantic, began to fall not to massive fleets, but to a strange, low-cost bomb that most commanders had dismissed as a waste of time. This is the story of how a cheap weapon, made from desperation, scrap metal, and raw ingenuity, ended an entire German fleet. Before we begin, if you love uncovering the forgotten secrets of war, subscribe to History of Wars, where every episode reveals how small ideas shaped the fate of nations. By 1943, the Kriegsmarine, Hitler's navy, was in trouble. The U-boats that once terrorized Allied convoys were being hunted down by radar, sonar, and relentless patrol aircraft. The once mighty battleships like Bismarck, Tirpitz, and Scharnhorst were trapped in their fjords, unable to challenge Allied control of the seas. Fuel was scarce. Steel was running out. But there was one thing Germany still had in abundance: engineers. Inside laboratories and factories from Hamburg to Peenemünde, men in grease-stained uniforms were told, "Build us a weapon that can change the war and do it cheap." It was in this climate that a small group of scientists began working on an idea once rejected by nearly everyone in the Luftwaffe. An idea that didn't look like a bomb at all. It was light, it was crude, and it was about to become one of the most destructive weapons ever dropped on water. In a small, dimly lit workshop stood a young engineer named Max Kramer. He was not a general nor a famous scientist, just a man obsessed with flight mechanics. Kramer believed that a bomb could fly like a glider, even after being dropped, if only it had small wings and a guidance system. But his concept was ridiculed. The Luftwaffe High Command told him, "We don't need toys, we need power." Still, Kramer persisted. He built prototypes from scrap aluminum and wood, barely held together with bolts and tape. They called it the Fritz X project, later nicknamed the Cheap Bomber's Miracle. It wasn't a missile in the modern sense, but it could be guided by radio signals from the plane that dropped it. The idea was simple: drop it from high altitude and steer it directly into the deck of an enemy ship. The bomb itself was little more than a 3,000-pound explosive core with 4 stubby wings. No engines, no computers, just gravity, and a pilot's radio hand controlling its fall. To the officers who saw it, it looked ridiculous. A gliding bomb? Controlled by hand? They laughed until the tests began. August 1943. The Allies were invading Italy. British and American fleets filled the Mediterranean, supporting troops landing in Sicily. To counter them, Germany launched a desperate aerial strike using its new secret weapon, the Fritz X bomb. From high above the clouds, WW2 I-17 bombers appeared, each carrying one bomb under its wing. The pilots released them from nearly 20,000 feet. In one moment, an Italian battleship, the Roma, became the first target. The bomb dropped silently, its wings cutting through the air like a falling hawk. The operator guided it toward the ship using a small joystick, watching its flare until it disappeared. Then, impact. The explosion tore through the battleship's deck, piercing her armor and detonating inside the magazines. Within minutes, Roma was engulfed in flame, splitting apart before sinking beneath the waves. Nearly 1,400 sailors perished. The world had just witnessed the dawn of precision bombing, and the Allies didn't even know what hit them. In the following weeks, the cheap bomb struck again and again. The USS Savannah was hit while supporting landings at Salerno. One bomb ripped through 5 decks before exploding, killing nearly 200 men. Moments later, the British cruiser Uganda was crippled by another. No one could explain how German planes, flying so high they couldn't be seen, were suddenly hitting ships with sniper-like accuracy. Admirals suspected a new type of torpedo or radar trick, but what they faced was even more dangerous. The Fritz X didn't need luck. It needed one operator, a steady hand, and a line of sight. As long as the bomb glowed in view, death could be guided by radio waves. To make matters worse, it cost less than a single tank to produce, a weapon so cheap and deadly that even Germany's collapsing industry could afford to build dozens. The Allies called it the pilot's revenge. And for the first time since 1940, they feared German aircraft again. As news spread, the Allies scrambled to find a countermeasure. Destroyers began releasing smoke screens to block visibility. Radio operators experimented with jamming frequencies, sometimes successfully, often too late. The once invincible fleets were now hiding from a falling shadow. One sailor from the Savannah later recalled, "We couldn't see it coming. It fell straight down from heaven. The only warning was the sound of hell after it hit." Yet, despite its success, the weapon had limits. It required clear skies. The bomber had to stay on course while guiding it, making it a sitting target for fighters. And Germany, stretched thin, couldn't protect its bombers long enough to use the weapon in large numbers. By late 1944, Allied air superiority had ended its reign. But for a few brief months, this cheap bomb ruled the seas, sinking ships that cost hundreds of millions to build for the price of a single car. When the war ended, the world moved on. But engineers didn't forget. The Fritz X became the ancestor of every smart bomb and guided missile that followed. Its concept, remote guidance, and precision control inspired generations of weapons from both NATO and the Soviet Union. What began as a cheap, mocked idea became the foundation of modern warfare. And behind it all was a handful of unknown mechanics and engineers who refused to accept that innovation had to be expensive. They proved that genius can be built from scraps, and that sometimes the cheapest idea can change the costliest war. When we look back at the wars that shaped our world, we often remember the grand generals, the massive ships, the endless armies. But history is full of quiet revolutions. The cheap bomb that ended a fleet wasn't built in a palace or a grand laboratory. It was built by men who still had oil on their hands and hunger in their eyes. They built what they could, with what they had. And in doing so, they changed the seas forever. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to History of Wars for more forgotten stories of invention, sacrifice, and the human minds behind the machines of war. Because sometimes it's not the generals who win history, it's the thinkers no one believed in.